Today, I think I want to talk about a commonplace modern expression that is a very strange turn of phrase. Mostly peaceful protests. As a social force, Black Lives Matter was declining. They were declining to the point that most people considered them irrelevant. But fortunately for Black Lives Matter, people got very bored and very stressed sitting inside for too long during the COVID isolation. So it didn't take too much of a spark to set the entire nation ablaze. Those who would support the protests were faced with a problem, though. There was violence and destruction and even death. Now, at a protest 3 years ago, just one single death was enough for the politically correct to hold an attitude of smug moral superiority over their opposition. And they held on to that for as long as possible, demanding denunciation of the violence and referring back to that incident again and again for well over a year, certain that they themselves would never see the day that demonstrations from their own causes might bring about loss of life. So how would it be possible for them to maintain their unwavering and total support for the nationwide protests when the protests were claiming human lives? People died, but they certainly wouldn't want to offer any more criticism than they absolutely had to. So when things started getting out of hand, you had the media and other assorted Black Lives Matter supporters and a large swath of vaguely generalized leftists all stressing the notion that the protests were and are mostly peaceful. Strangely enough, a lot of the people who were inclined to criticize the violence in the riots quite often led with the phrase, mostly peaceful. Some of them would even thank the protesters for that. Good on them for protesting peacefully. You gotta give them credit for protesting properly and peacefully. What an absurdly low bar to set. I never understood that one, because if you were to say it plainly, you would say, I really want to give credit to these people because most of them are not assaulting people and destroying property. I want to express my gratitude to them for not setting fires and terrorizing people. Well done for not committing crimes today. Back to the particular phrase in question, though. Mostly peaceful. You have to admit that the protests are mostly peaceful. When I think about that, it makes me wonder why anyone would use this phrase to defend anything. You see, when you say that a protest is mostly peaceful, you are also admitting that it is partly violent. Mostly peaceful immediately implies partly violent. It seems to me that denouncing the violence and rioting should have been a universal impulse. If I were a Black Lives Matter supporter, if I were a devout leftist, if I were an actual on-the-ground protester, I don't think that I would have tried to shield the protests by admitting that they're partly violent. Instead, I think I would have handled it by decrying the damage done by the looters and rioters. I would have claimed that the violence is not even a part of the protest, and that anyone engaging in it is just a filthy, savage criminal, and therefore should not be associated with the protests. That would have been a much more intelligent response. Instead of recognizing the violence and the crime, though, the social justice crowd instead tried a bit of sleight of hand. Instead of denouncing the violence of these partly violent protests, they tried to divert attention away from it. The protests are mostly peaceful. The protests are only partly violent, so keep your attention on the protesters who are not setting fires and assaulting people. Oh, and the ones who are setting fires and assaulting people, don't you dare call them thugs or criminals. The strange thing is, this tactic was reasonably effective. A lot of people who should have known better were stumbling all over themselves, racing to admit to the peaceful nature of these partly violent protests. If I find fault in a protest, even a protest that is entirely peaceful instead of just mostly peaceful, I should not have to preface that by making sure that everyone knows that I know that a peaceful protest is acceptable. I certainly shouldn't have to award brownie points to my political and social opposition just because they were not smashing windows. Having said that, a lot of people were smashing windows. They continue to. Widespread unrest is a pretty tame term for it. So I don't believe I'm going to let anyone hide behind the phrase mostly peaceful, as though that is some sort of commendation. From now on, I will refer to these protests as partly violent.